What is up, my Plata people? Welcome back to the Perry Ekimai channel, where we are answering LDS truth claims. We are here on our 17th episode, and we are going through a bunch of episodes from the LDS truth claim series. In this one, this actually presents a pretty interesting challenge for this series. The next 6 episodes of McDonald's series go into issues regarding theology, and these can be interesting topics to dive into. But it's actually really difficult to see how we can get into showing that no naturalistic explanation can account for the claims being made in this episode. And so really this just became a truncated response to all of the things that McDonald puts forward, because there's not a whole lot of substance for me to really dig into to say yay or nay on anything naturalistic. Yeah, that does mean that episodes 24 through 29, 6 episodes, are going to be crammed into this single episode. So if it seems like I'm just skipping over a whole lot, I am. To help explain this perspective, for the most part, I don't disagree with what McDonald has to say about what Joseph Smith is really doing with his theological innovations. I don't disagree, for example, that he was providing answers to challenges with classical theism or Christian theology. When McDonald presents his summary argument for the section, I found that I agreed with him about almost everything that he had to say. In that sense, just note that if things are skipped over, it's generally because there's nothing that I really disagree with him about in those places, or it's just not something that's really of interest to really litigate any further. It's just not really relevant to the goals of this particular series in responding to Brett. McDonald makes references to the argument from contingency. In essence, things are either necessary, they must exist in all possible worlds, or they are contingent. They exist in this world due to some cause, but there is no necessity to their existence. An infinite regress of causes is impossible, therefore there must exist a first cause of some kind, and that first cause is God. McDonald knows that Joseph Smith's theology manages to ignore this problem by having all matter be effectively necessary. We are co-eternal with the gods, insomuch as our intelligences have always existed. However, this fails to handle the problem of the infinite regress. If Elohim had a god, and his god had a god, then his god had a god. Who was the first god? Perhaps there is no first god, and it is just an infinite regress of gods. Rather than being a solution to this particular problem, Joseph just doesn't really deal with it, mostly because he was too dead to elaborate on anything that he said in the King Follett Discourse. There are some fun quips from McDonald, like Joseph Smith's theology dissolves the question of nihilism and the threat of non-being. I mean, sure, he gave an answer which rejects nihilism and the idea that existence could ever cease. However, there is a rather compelling case to be made that eventual non-existence is preferable to being unable to escape the unending and eternal monotony of existence. Now, spoiler warning for The Good Place, it's now kind of an old show. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. But the last 2 episodes of the show dealt with that very problem. Joseph Smith doesn't solve the issue, he just gives an answer. McDonald also shares claims that physicalism is wrong because spiritual entities exist. Now, I invite McDonald to demonstrate the existence of spiritual entities, and I will abandon physicalism. Until then, it just seems that humans are nucleic acid cell structures, nerve nets, and complicated phenomena called the mental, mixed in with some anxiety. There is a rather fun claim in the discussion of creation ex nihilo. McDonald rightly points out that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is a later philosophical idea that cropped up long after the first generation of Christians were all dead. He then makes the audacious claim that Joseph Smith's ideas regarding creation ex materia restored the original Christian understanding of creation. In only the broadest of possible terms is that correct. For Joseph, learning from the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment had made clear that the earth is not the center of creation. For early Christians, however, the idea that the earth was not the center was just not an extant concept, not with any meaningful articulation at least. So Joseph's idea of the earth as a single creation among the numberless worlds God had created from pre-existing matter would be just as foreign to an early Christian as creation ex nihilo would be to them. But yeah, the broad concept is at least similar. I'm enjoying just how bold and kind of dumb these conclusion statements are from the series. By denying creation ex nihilo, Joseph Smith's theology obliterates the central Christological dispute, as if there was not an active Christological dispute ongoing in the 1st century CE before creation ex nihilo was even around, that we can observe within the Gospels themselves. Yeah, Joseph just obliterates it for sure. There are several places where McDonald suggests that Joseph Smith was introducing these grand ideas of God and philosophy that are now only being accepted. I wonder why he does not cite any non-LDS philosophers or theologians who cite Joseph Smith's ideas as influential in forming their conclusions. He also seems to want to treat Joseph Smith as though he existed in a vacuum, where everyone believed the same ideas about God. But this is a period where like the Watchtower Society, Ellen White, and a bunch of other religious movements would kick off. Many of these groups come to similar, albeit distinct, ideas about like these exact same challenges that Joseph is wrestling with. The section on the divine feminine is a bit obnoxious and pretentious. Yes, Joseph did create an avenue wherein the divine feminine could be recognized, acknowledged, and esteemed. Yet, if you were to seek to understand the attributes of the Heavenly Mother through the teachings of Joseph Smith, you would find nothing but what can be inferred from the broadest strokes of information. Is there just one Heavenly Mother? What's her name? How does she feel about the decisions that Elohim makes? Where is she in the presentation of the endowment? What exactly was her role in the creation of the world? I also enjoyed McDonald acting as though Joseph claiming to receive new revelations from God was this groundbreaking, earth-shattering thing that no one in his milieu would have even considered. We're just going to pretend that like Ellen White didn't exist. Admittedly, Joseph did have his own way of doing things, but he was not the only person who claimed to be receiving new revelations. Also, there was an active debate about how the Apocrypha should be used in Joseph Smith's lifetime. We see that reflected in his revelation on the topic in Doctrine and Covenants 91. The idea that questions regarding canon closed after one of the ecumenical councils and remained closed until modern scholarship raised questions about that is kind of silly. MacDonald spends quite a bit of time on the idea that Joseph resolves the soteriological problem of evil by introducing the doctrine of baptism for the dead. To review, the soteriological problem of evil looks at how the fact that there are people in like rural communities in China who will never hear the name of Jesus Christ, who would be damned to hell because they never accepted Jesus Christ, under the idea that salvation really only comes in and through the name of Jesus and through accepting him. So yeah, baptisms for the dead is a solution to that problem. In this case, however, we know that Joseph was specifically concerned with this issue. His brother Alvin died without baptism. He had children who died in their infancy. Different parts of this problem are addressed at different stages of Joseph's ministry. I agree that Joseph presents a solution to the problem. So that's the soteriological problem of evil, but what about the logical problem of evil? Basically, the logical problem of evil considers the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God and says that such a God would not permit evil to exist. Yet, evil does exist. Therefore, there is no all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God. If your theology does not include an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, your mileage may vary on those specific adjectives, but that's the gist, then your theology is not subject to the logical problem of evil. I do like the Epicurean framing that MacDonald shares, though. Quote, either God is unwilling to prevent evil or he is unable. If he is unwilling, then he cannot be perfectly good. If he is unable, then he cannot be all-powerful. Whence then evil? MacDonald first presents a soul-making theodicy, the idea that evil exists to shape souls into the forms that God wants them to be. This can be challenged by asking if God is unable to make souls without evil. If he is unable to make souls without evil, then he cannot be all-powerful. If he is able to make such souls without evil, then given that evil exists, he cannot be all good. Regardless your preferred Joseph Smith theodicy or solution to the problem of evil, none seems adequate for the problem of natural suffering. This is a variant of the problem of evil that has been a challenge for modern apologetics to address. I've heard about many times. I'm yet to find a response that I find even close to adequate. Now, I did sit down with Leo Winiger over on Colby Reddish's channel, Let's Disagree, where we did talk for a time about the problem of natural suffering, and we do intend on having future discussions. So if you would like to see a little bit more of a take on that and a little bit more detail and some actual like back and forth responses to that, go check that out. We had a good time. And the problem of natural suffering is similar to the logical problem of evil, but it instead points to the suffering in the natural world. For example, the life cycle of parasitoid wasps, which is basically if the life cycle of the xenomorph from like the Alien franchise were pasted onto the arthropod world. I am also partial to the example often used by Stephen Fry of bone cancer in children. Is God truly so weak or unclever that he could not fulfill his purposes without bone cancer in children? And a final variant of the problem of evil that is relevant to LDS truth claims is the problem of divine hiddenness. I choose to frame the problem this way. I do not believe that the Book of Mormon is true. Does God desire for me to believe that the Book of Mormon is true? Does he know what would convince me of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon without violating my agency? Is he powerful enough to do that which would convince me of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon without violating my agency? Then why has he not done that? You may see similarities to this idea with how like Epicurus frames the problem of evil. There are responses to the problem of divine hiddenness, but most are still quite weak. They fail to deal with non-resistant non-believers. Joseph Smith's teachings, including in Alma 32 and Moroni 10, seem to run headfirst into this particular problem. When we get to atonement theory, McDonald just has to get his jabs in. Quote, the scandal to humanistic people is the idea that they cannot make it alone, that their reason will not save them. Close quote. Honestly, that is not the core issue for me when it comes to atonement theory. The idea that God needs blood to forgive is the core issue. Humanists, funnily enough, tend to not demand the shedding of blood to forgive others. McDonald just seems to have a profound lack of understanding for differing worldviews. When he describes the non-Christian perspective, which ostensibly does not include atheists and agnostics, who are most likely relegated to humanistic people, he suggests the problem is that God condescended in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there may be some non-Christians who would take issue with that, but not all non-Christians would find that to be the problem. They might likewise wonder why an atonement is necessary at all. Is God so weak as to be powerless to forgive sins without a blood sacrifice? Why are animal or plant sacrifices insufficient? Personally, I think it's a problem because it is clearly an adapted idea to explain why the supposed Messiah did not fulfill any of the prophecies that he was supposed to fulfill. Do you remember being taught that the Jews were expecting a military leader to overthrow the Romans and that's why they missed the whole point about Jesus being the Messiah? Well, that's because every time the Old Testament actually prophesied about a Messiah, it was a person who would restore the Davidic throne and usher in an era of peace and prosperity for Israel and, by ethnocentric extension, the entire world. Jesus of Nazareth did not do that. The stories that we get after the fact in the New Testament are just the justifications for why that did not happen, along with some prophecies about how Jesus would return again and be that military Messiah before the first generation of Christians had entirely passed away. Now, 2,000 years later, we still have no sign of his actual return. This is my problem with the idea of the atonement. It is not what the Old Testament prophets prophesied of. It makes little sense that a good, loving, and powerful God requires such a sacrifice, and it fits well with the idea that the early Christians were trying to justify the failure of their messianic figure. Now, it would be fair to point out that McDonald actually agrees that the atonement is necessary because of the nature of intelligences, but nowhere in his presentation does he actually show how the nature of intelligences requires a blood sacrifice. He jumped to a different square because he failed to defend the exact same problem as before. Only we change it from what it is about God that requires such a sacrifice to what it is about intelligences that require such a sacrifice. Again, lacking any actual explanation for the same. And that's it for theology. Yeah, this is a really short one. There wasn't much for me to actually get into and cover, despite McDonald going through 6 different episodes of this. And we are almost to the end of this series. The final section is McDonald responding to criticisms, and given his track record so far, that really just has me worried. We're going to do a whole big wrap-up after as well, and we'll actually evaluate the 2 big arguments. But until next time, thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all the fun YouTube things, and I will catch you in the next one. Later.